There is a massive geopolitical anomaly out there, one that defies all logic, economics, and basic human common sense on a daily basis. Situated in South Asia, this is a territory forged in 1947 as a safe haven for millions of believers. But over a few short decades, it mutated into a flawless, self-destructing trap. Today, anyone with half a brain is desperately trying to escape it. This nation possesses the most lethal weaponry in human history. It hides dozens of nuclear warheads in underground bunkers, capable of turning major metropolitan areas into radioactive ash in a matter of minutes. Yet, it can't even provide its own citizens with clean drinking water, a stable power grid, or a functioning sewage system. The cramped streets of its overpopulated cities are suffocating under a thick blanket of smog, dust, and crushing poverty. Meanwhile, the generals and corrupt bureaucrats speed down wide avenues in black armored SUVs, streets tightly locked down by heavily armed soldiers. This is the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, a state that long ago devolved into a massive, bloody, and entirely hopeless experiment played out on 240 million living, breathing people. It's almost impossible to grasp the sheer scale of this tragedy from the comfort of a suburban American home. We are talking about a population the size of nearly an entire continent, locked within the borders of a parched, scorching wasteland. A place with no real jobs, no decent education, and absolutely no guarantee that tomorrow will even come for you or your kids. For decades, the elites of this country have been peddling one foolproof product to the rest of the globe: fear. They extort the US, its allies, and international financial institutions, using their own instability as leverage. At every diplomatic summit, they scream that if they don't get another multi-billion-dollar bailout right now, their house of cards will collapse, and control of the nuclear button will fall directly into the hands of bearded zealots just waiting for their moment. And the world dutifully pays up. It funnels billions of dollars into this black hole just to delay the inevitable, knowing that the collapse of a heavily populated nuclear power would trigger a tsunami of chaos globally. But that money never reaches the everyday people breaking their backs 14 hours a day for pennies. Instead, it vanishes into offshore accounts. It morphs into luxury real estate in the Middle East and London. It funds gated, high-end communities exclusively for the military caste, complete with pristine golf courses and 24/7 electricity. Outside the high walls of those luxury oases lies the real, brutal, and unforgiving world. Down there, the poor fight to the death over a free bag of flour from a relief truck. Down there, an enraged mob can stone a man to death right in the middle of the street over a ridiculous rumor or a fake blasphemy charge. And the law? It only protects whoever is holding an assault rifle or a thick stack of dirty cash. This is a system that has cannibalized itself. It blew every last ounce of its scarce resources on an endless, pointless feud with its neighbors. It incubated a monster of radical fanaticism that is now dictating terms to the government itself. It completely forgot that a functional state is supposed to build new schools, modern factories, and hospitals, not just army barracks and classified test sites. This nation is living in a state of permanent bankruptcy. It constantly teeters on the edge of a deep abyss, while its leaders put on a brave face and pretend everything is going exactly according to plan. In reality, the plan burned to the ground in the fires of corruption a long time ago, and the steering wheel has been ripped right out of the dashboard. You won't find any inspiring success stories here. You won't see any smooth transitions to a brighter future. Time in this country is stuck in a vicious loop, bouncing from one harsh military coup to the next, from one IMF loan to another humiliating default. And with every brutal rotation of this cycle, the steel noose tightens around the necks of tens of millions of ordinary people, cutting off their oxygen and leaving them without a shred of hope that this endless nightmare will ever be over. Picture a hopeless gambling addict who walks into the same pawn shop every single month to hawk the last items from his house for a new, life-saving hit of cash. And every single time, he tearfully swears it's absolutely the last time. That's exactly how Pakistan's economy operates. It's been hopelessly hooked up to the International Monetary Fund's life support machine for years. This massive nation has begged for emergency multi-billion-dollar bailouts over 20 times in its history. An absolute, humiliating world record that proves one thing: the state is pathologically incapable of generating its own revenue. The elites grab these lifelines, solemnly swear from podiums to enact tough reforms, and sycophantically shake hands with suited global bankers. But then those colossal sums simply vanish into the black holes of elaborate corruption schemes, landing in the offshore accounts of army generals and political dynasties, while everyday people are left with nothing but crippling inflation that burns their meager savings to the ground. The national currency, the Pakistani rupee, is in such a terrifying, uncontrolled freefall that prices for basic staples like onions, sugar, and wheat flour skyrocket in a matter of days. An average textile worker, barely scraping by due to constant rolling blackouts, has to grind for an entire week just to buy a small bag of rice to feed his family. And this relentless, exhausting cycle of poverty is driving people insane. Textiles used to be the pride of the nation, with millions of looms clattering day and night to stock the shelves of global retail stores. But today, entire industrial zones are nothing more than concrete ghosts. Driven by a catastrophic foreign exchange shortage, the country periodically halts all imports, leaving shipping containers packed with essential goods to rust in seaports for weeks because the government simply can't afford to clear them. Hospitals run out of basic meds like insulin and simple painkillers, while factories grind to a dead halt without raw materials, tossing millions of desperate, starving people out onto the sweltering streets with absolutely nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. But international creditors at least demand boring financial reports and unpopular reforms, so Pakistan found itself a new, far more generous, and much quieter master to the east. Beijing rolled in with a colossal economic corridor project, dropping tens of billions of dollars to build new highways, massive coal-fired power plants, and the Gwadar deep-water port right on the edge of the Arabian Sea. Local politicians were practically choking with excitement, shouting from the rooftops about the great, unbreakable friendship between the two nations, calling it a salvation and a new era of unprecedented prosperity. Though they forgot to tell their people that the only free cheese is in a mousetrap. Today, that much-hyped project has morphed into a textbook debt trap from which there is zero chance of escape. The Chinese build this infrastructure using exclusively their own workforce and materials, and they hand out these massive loans at such brutal, predatory interest rates that Pakistan physically won't be able to pay them off even in 100 years. And when the bill finally comes due and the state treasury is completely empty, the country starts paying with its own sovereignty. It submissively hands Beijing control over strategic ports for the next 40 years and grants colossal tax breaks to Chinese state-owned enterprises, which decisively and irreversibly crushes local medium-sized businesses, leaving them without a single fighting chance. This is the perfect, sterile, and bloodless colonialism of the 21st century, where foreign territory isn't conquered with rumbling tanks and infantry, but with sneaky credit agreements, hidden clauses, and massive infrastructure investments. Pakistan sold its future wholesale, voluntarily mortgaging its coastlines, transit routes, and the very lives of its next generations. All so a tiny ruling class could live in the sweet illusion of financial stability and ride around in fresh armored cars for a few more years. This economy has been dead for a long time, producing absolutely nothing except astronomical debt and cheap, completely disenfranchised labor for the wealthy Gulf states, where millions of young Pakistanis flee to endure hellish construction jobs just to send remittances home, the only thing barely keeping this broken system from a total, devastating collapse. It's a miserable life lived with an outstretched hand on the very edge of a cliff, where every new lifeline loan only guarantees that the next fall will be deeper, bloodier, and entirely inescapable. Demographics is the most precise and ruthless science on the planet. It has absolutely zero tolerance for empty political slogans and never forgives systemic failures. 240 million people. That is a colossal, terrifyingly massive population, crammed tightly within the borders of a state where the economy has been dead for years. We're constantly fed beautiful fairy tales about the demographic dividend, about the fresh, youthful energy that supposedly propels nations forward and builds a brighter tomorrow. But here, in these scorching, dust-choked cities, this youth bulge has mutated into the most terrifying ticking time bomb. Over 60% of the entire population is under the age of 30. That's tens of millions of starving, angry young men, completely stripped of hope, living in a country that can offer them absolutely nothing. They have no real jobs, no quality education, and not even the slightest guarantee that tomorrow they'll be able to afford a piece of meat or rent a decent place to sleep. Every single year, Pakistan's population swells by another 5 million people. That means every godforsaken day, this impoverished country needs to be building hundreds of new schools and hospitals and creating thousands of jobs, but they are building absolutely nothing. This giant life manufacturing factory is running at maximum capacity, but it's pumping people out into an absolute pitch-black void. The public education system collapsed under the crushing weight of total corruption and chronic underfunding a long time ago. Instead of normal math or physics classes, millions of kids from dirt-poor families are funneled into free religious schools, where they are handed a bowl of cheap rice and taught nothing but blind, aggressive fanaticism. The authorities voluntarily surrendered the minds of their own children to radicals because the state simply doesn't have the cash to pay teachers or buy textbooks. Meanwhile, these kids are sitting on cheap internet connections, scrolling through social media reels, watching how comfortably and freely the rest of the functional world lives. And this brutal contrast between the vibrant virtual paradise on the screen of a cheap smartphone and their own stinking, filthy street with an open sewer is literally driving them insane. It breeds a deep, dark frustration. You can save money for years. You can even get a degree in engineering or software development. But in harsh reality, you'll still end up pedaling a rusty tuk-tuk or hauling heavy bricks on a construction site for a couple of bucks a day. And this sheer hopelessness easily converts into a deafening, primal rage. These young men are fleeing en masse from sun-scorched, dead villages into massive metropolitan areas like Karachi or Lahore, which are already suffocating under heavy smog. These cities long ago devolved into endless, putrid slums, where people sleep on top of each other, where mountains of garbage rot right on the roads, and where you have to stand in line for days just for cloudy drinking water, risking a knife in the back and a street brawl over your spot. And those who are a little smarter, or who have scraped together some meager family savings, choose the only path of salvation available to them. They choose to run. You've definitely seen those horrifying news reports about old, rusting boats packed full of people that regularly capsize in the cold waters of the Mediterranean. Half of the people on those doomed vessels are young Pakistanis, ready to risk their own lives, ready to suffocate in a cargo hold or drown in dark waters, just to avoid staying in this endless hell. They sell off the last crumbs of their parents' land. They plunge into monstrous debt with international smugglers, all just to get a microscopic chance at washing dishes in a back room somewhere in Greece or Italy. The state has simply thrown an entire generation overboard, leaving these guys to slowly rot in narrow alleyways where drug addiction and brutal street crime flourish. This country produces only one truly stable resource, and that resource is despair. And when these tens of millions of young, strong men finally realize they have absolutely nothing left to lose in this life, they will take to the streets, and this colossal demographic explosion will obliterate any police cordons. It will tear down the high fences of elite neighborhoods, and it will burn this broken, rotten system to the very ground, leaving not even a handful of gray ash from the illusion of a great nuclear state. Any normal, healthy country maintains a military to protect its borders from external threats. But in Pakistan, it works exactly the other way around. The state doesn't have an army. The army has its own state. We are constantly fed these glossy, vibrant images of election campaigns. Millions of people at rallies, impassioned speeches by politicians in crisp white clothes, promising freedom and unprecedented prosperity to the masses. But it's all just a highly expensive, flawlessly produced, and endless theatrical performance put on for the benefit of naive international creditors and global human rights watchdogs. Behind this glossy democratic facade stands an absolutely impenetrable, cold, and brutal wall of military dictatorship. The Pakistani generals never really went back to their barracks. Since the very first day of the country's independence, they have kept their hands firmly wrapped around the throat of civilian leadership. Over the last 70-plus years, not a single prime minister of this massive nuclear power has managed to complete their full, legally mandated term in office. The moment any civilian leader shows the slightest hint of independence, the moment they try to normalize relations with neighboring India, or, even worse, try to peek into the classified defense budget, they are immediately and ruthlessly annihilated. They might be slapped with treason charges, thrown behind bars on fabricated corruption cases, forced into exile in London, or simply assassinated. Then they are instantly replaced by a fresh, convenient, and obedient puppet who will sign the necessary decrees and never ask too many questions of the men with stars on their shoulders. And this isn't just a thirst for political power, it's a colossal, insatiable financial octopus. The Pakistani armed forces aren't just about tanks, fighter jets, and secret nuclear testing sites. They operate as the largest commercial empire in the country, a giant corporate holding that officially owns absolutely everything that generates real cash. They control the major banks, own cement plants, run massive construction firms, manage transport networks, and even operate factories pumping out cornflakes and bottled water. You can be born in this country, spend your entire life eating bread baked in an army bakery, work in a factory owned by the generals, and ultimately be buried on land controlled by a military foundation. It's a parallel economy, a massive slush fund that pays zero taxes into the emaciated national budget and remains completely shielded from any public or independent financial audits. While ordinary folks fork over their last rupees for electricity that constantly gets shut off, the highest-ranking officers live in an entirely different, isolated reality. They build themselves gargantuan, heavily guarded, closed-off cities, so-called defense housing authorities. These are legitimate elite enclaves smack in the middle of impoverished, suffocating megacities. In there, you have perfectly paved roads, lavish golf courses, private schools for the elite's kids, and round-the-clock power supplied by massive generators, while just over the fence, millions of ordinary people are drowning in filth and darkness. This military caste has morphed into the new, brutal, feudal lords of the 21st century. They view themselves as the sole true saviors of the nation, genuinely believing that they alone have the right to decide who governs, what the newspapers print, and what movies get shown on TV. But to justify this privileged status and their colossal budgets, which incinerate nearly half of all state funds, they desperately need a permanent, terrifying, and merciless enemy. That's why they've spent decades fueling hysteria over the Kashmir conflict with India, artificially maintaining a boiling point of unbelievable primal hatred. Because the day genuine, lasting peace breaks out on that border is the day the public will no longer need such a massive, gluttonous, and arrogant army. The generals understand perfectly well. Peace is the death of their business empire. So they will keep this bloody spectacle going. They will keep throwing journalists who dare to speak the truth into prison cells, and they will keep snatching dissenting political activists right off the streets without a trial or a warrant. This system has gridlocked any chance of normal development, siphoning every resource out of the country and leaving behind nothing but paranoia, abject poverty, and millions of terrified people who know one golden rule: if you want to survive in this country, never, under any circumstances, cross a man in a military uniform. The price of a human life in this country plummeted below the cost of a rusted bullet or a dirty rock on the side of the road a long time ago. The streets are drowning in a wild, uncontrollable epidemic of primal rage. The state itself hand-fed this aggression. For years, bureaucrats sought to use religious zealots as pawns in their dirty political games and hybrid wars. But the rabid dog slipped its leash a long time ago, and is now biting the hand of its old master. The ultimate weapon of this mass terror is the blasphemy law. On paper, the text demands the death penalty for insulting sacred figures, but in reality, only a fraction of the accused ever make it to a formal courtroom. The street has long since usurped the roles of prosecutor, judge, and executioner, and the mechanics of this collective insanity operate with terrifying, fine-tuned precision. Someone simply dislikes your social media post, intercepts a weird text message, or overhears a fragmented sentence in a loud marketplace. Within minutes, hysterical calls for a lynching blast from the crackling, rusted loudspeakers on the roof of the nearest mosque. An enraged mob materializes instantly. Thousands of young men armed with iron rebars, jerry cans of gasoline, and heavy clubs smash their way into homes. They drag screaming, terrified people right out of their beds and beat them to death, while mothers and children sob on their knees. They shatter bones, burn bodies right in the middle of traffic, and then cheerfully snap selfies in front of the blazing pyre. And the most chilling part of this whole picture is the absolutely pathetic, paralyzed police force. Uniformed men gripping assault rifles just stand on the sidelines and cowardly look away. They are too terrified to take even a single step toward the infuriated mass, knowing perfectly well that the mob will tear them to pieces alongside the victim if they dare to stand up for the law. The state simply vanishes. It evaporates entirely the exact second the fanatics smell blood. But the true sickness of the situation is that the overwhelming majority of these accusations have absolutely nothing to do with defending the faith. It's pure, cynical business. The perfect tool for settling petty personal scores. Got a thriving business that's annoying your neighbor? They'll brand you a blasphemer, burn your shop to the ground, and your cunning rival sweeps up all your customers. Refused to sell your plot of fertile land to a local mobster for pennies? Tomorrow, rocks come flying into your yard, and you're fleeing the city, leaving everything you own behind. It is legalized racketeering, where religion serves as nothing more than a convenient, bulletproof shield for common thugs. The entire judicial and political machine is soaked in a sticky, animalistic fear. Judges hide their faces, terrified to hand down acquittals. They know with absolute certainty that saving an innocent life means paying with the lives of their own children. Ministers and lawmakers are afraid to even whisper about softening this cannibalistic law. Politicians vividly remember the fate of the few brave souls who were gunned down by their own bodyguards in broad daylight. And nobody cursed those killers. On the contrary, they were showered with rose petals on their way to jail, and their graves were turned into literal pilgrimage sites where crowds bring flowers and pray to them as holy heroes. It's a total distortion of morality, where a brutal murderer becomes a saint, and the victim is left to rot in an unmarked ditch. Millions of Christians, Hindus, and other minorities live in a state of perpetual, paralyzing terror. They teach their children to speak in whispers, and they scrub their phones of any questionable memes before stepping outside. They are deathly afraid of drinking water from the same cup as their coworkers, because a single sideways glance can trigger a massive slaughter. And this isn't just a localized tragedy in some poor, remote province. All of this is unfolding in a country where military bases are packed tight with nuclear warheads. Radicals march through the capital, shut down major trade routes, and blockade megacities of millions, while the government cowardly backs down every single time. The administration submissively signs another piece of paper offering concessions. But the monster figured out a long time ago that its master is weak, terrified, and utterly helpless. And now, this monster will demand more and more human blood until it swallows this miserable country whole. It will leave behind nothing but scorched earth, shattered homes, and a blind, fanatical darkness that absolutely cannot be reasoned with. For far too long, we've been conditioned to think that the ultimate enemy of any state is a foreign army, terrorists, or corrupt politicians. But we've completely forgotten that nature can kill far more efficiently and mercilessly than any armed conflict. For Pakistan, the climate apocalypse is no longer some sci-fi movie scenario set in the distant future. It is a terrifying, daily reality methodically wiping entire regions off the map right now. This massive territory is caught in a deadly vice grip between rapidly melting glaciers in the north and a scorching, boiling hellscape in the south. Just picture the city of Jacobabad, officially recognized as one of the hottest places on planet Earth. In the summer, temperatures there shatter the 125-degree Fahrenheit mark. That's not just a bad heat wave. That is the absolute physical limit of human survival. The asphalt literally melts underfoot, birds drop dead from the scorching sky, and people are forced to hide in dark, un-air-conditioned concrete boxes because the country's power grid shuts down for 16 hours a day. They go to sleep on wet bed sheets, praying their hearts don't give out from heat stroke before dawn. And while one half of the country is slowly burning alive in this demonic oven, the other half is sinking underwater. In 2022, this land was battered by rains so monstrous that a third of Pakistan's entire territory, just wrap your head around that scale, a third of a country the size of Great Britain, simply vanished beneath murky, contaminated water. Giant, raging torrents snapped iron bridges like matchsticks, washing away entire villages along with the people still sleeping in their beds. They annihilated millions of acres of fertile farmland and drowned millions of livestock. Overnight, more than 30 million people lost absolutely everything. Their homes, their savings, their entire lives. They sat stranded on tiny islands of dry dirt, surrounded by an endless ocean of rotting water, filled with the floating corpses of animals. People waited for relief helicopters that never came, because the government simply had no money and no fuel to run rescue operations. The elites in Islamabad just threw their hands up and begged international lenders for yet another bailout to repair the damage. They constantly whined about global warming, but bureaucrats cynically omitted the fact that for decades, they had been clear-cutting forests, illegally building luxury gated communities on river floodplains, and completely abandoning the drainage systems built by British colonizers a century ago. But the most terrifying part of this ecological catastrophe is the inescapable thirst. A country entirely dependent on the Indus River is rapidly drying out from the inside. Farmers are drilling wells deeper and deeper, pumping out groundwater at such an insane rate that the earth is literally collapsing. Major cities, including Lahore and Karachi, are barreling toward the moment when the water simply stops flowing from the taps. Local water mafias already control entire neighborhoods. Armed thugs seize public pumps and sell dirty, toxic water to the poor for the price of gold. Politicians can wave their nuclear warheads around and threaten neighboring India all they want. They can throw their enemies in jail and throttle the internet, but they are absolutely powerless against the laws of physics. No military parade is going to stop the ice from melting in the mountains, and no amount of religious chanting will force barren soil to yield a harvest again. Millions of climate refugees are already trekking from flooded and scorched villages into overcrowded megacities. They set up squalid tent camps along the highways, fighting over a scrap of bread and a sip of muddy water. This is generating a colossal amount of social tension, ready to detonate at any second. The national budget is bursting at the seams, inflation is devouring meager welfare payouts, and global financial institutions are long past sick of dumping billions of dollars into this black hole. Global bankers know perfectly well that this money will either be washed away by the next monsoon or embezzled by local ministers. Nature has declared a war of total annihilation on this country, and in this war, humanity doesn't stand a single chance of winning. They demolished their own home with their own hands, long before the first drops of that deadly rain ever fell from the sky. In the 21st century, a civilization's level of development isn't measured by the number of nuclear warheads sitting in underground silos, but by a state's ability to simply flip a switch and keep the lights on. Yet this most basic, fundamental task has proven absolutely impossible for this massive country. When a megacity of 20 million people is suddenly, silently severed from the power grid, it's not some romantic candlelit evening. It's an instantaneous plunge into sticky, primal chaos and suffocation. In Pakistan, this devastating process was elevated to a daily government routine a long time ago, complete with its own mocking bureaucratic buzzword: load shedding. Local politicians utter this phrase on TV screens with such bored indifference you'd think they were talking about a light spring shower, when in reality they are talking about the methodical, ruthless cutting of power for 10, 12, and in poorer provincial areas, up to 16 hours a day. The energy grid of this proud nuclear power has long since mutated into a terminally ill, gluttonous monster, suffocated to death by what they call circular debt. The national treasury owes tens of billions of rupees to private power plants. The owners of those plants are drowning in debt to suppliers of dirty coal and expensive fuel oil. And the impoverished, desperate population physically cannot afford the astronomical electric bills cynically shoved under their doors every single month. And when this rusted, thoroughly corrupt chain predictably jams, the main breaker is thrown, plunging the nation into darkness. Cities immediately collapse into a black hole, a nightmare multiplied by the scorching, lethal summer heat. Without electricity, massive water pumps grind to an immediate halt, and the last drops of water vanish from the faucets of millions of cramped apartments. Exhausted and terribly thirsty, people are forced to drink cloudy, foul-smelling liquid from dirty street wells because old sewer pipes burst regularly, allowing human waste to freely mix with the drinking water supply, right beneath the melting asphalt. Food in dead refrigerators rots instantly, and tiny street stalls and workshops go bankrupt because you simply can't sew clothes or fix a broken part without light. Massive, overcrowded hospitals are plunged into pitch blackness right in the middle of complex surgical procedures, leaving sweaty, exhausted doctors frantically trying to stitch up wounds under the dim glow of cheap cell phone flashlights. Old diesel generators in the hospital courtyards violently cough up black smoke and stall out due to a severe shortage of smuggled fuel, leaving patients on ventilators to slowly die in silence. Every single traffic light dies at the intersections, paralyzing broad avenues in a wild, roaring meat grinder of old painted buses, animal-drawn carts, and thousands of overheated motorcycles, where all traffic laws are completely erased and only a blind instinct for survival rules. And in this thick darkness that burns your lungs, the monstrous social divide tearing this society to pieces becomes visible with absolute clarity, as if under a magnifying glass. While the poor bleed acidic sweat in their windowless concrete boxes, swatting away clouds of malarial mosquitoes with scraps of damp newspaper, life behind the high walls of elite neighborhoods goes on completely uninterrupted. There, giant imported generators the size of small houses hum monotonously, burning through tons of expensive diesel fuel, just so bloated generals, corrupt judges, and ministers can sleep peacefully under the icy blast of heavy-duty AC units. The wealthy caste cowardly severed itself from the rotting state system. They buy their own private bottled water, their own private uninterrupted power, and their own private armed security, leaving the rest of the country to slowly drown in the deafening gloom of the Middle Ages. All this basic infrastructure was built by British colonizers decades ago, and since then, the newly independent authorities have cared about only one thing: how to squeeze the very last drops of profit out of those aging pipes and thinning wires. Tens of billions of dollars allocated by global banks over the years for the urgent modernization of these dilapidated grids have vanished without a trace into the bottomless pockets of local bureaucrats. Transformer boxes on narrow streets now look like horrifying iron nests of thousands of tangled exposed wires that erupt into lethal flames at the slightest drop of summer rain. Little kids play in dirty puddles right next to electrocuted stray dogs because snapped high-voltage cables lie in the liquid mud for weeks, and absolutely zero municipal services give a damn. A state that loudly proclaims its ambitions for absolute leadership of the Islamic world at every diplomatic summit has essentially signed off on its own complete, hopeless technical impotence. They can launch a ballistic missile with massive pageantry or buy a new squadron of fighter jets, but they are catastrophically incapable of making sure an ordinary working man's old ceiling fan keeps spinning. It is the slow agonizing, and shameful death of urban civilization, where massive, once thriving metropolises mutate into scorching concrete jungles physically unfit for survival. And with every new nationwide systemic blackout, when an entire country falls into a blind black hole for days on end, this nation takes yet another confident step backward into that primal state where the only thing ruling the roost is blind animal terror of the creeping, all-consuming darkness. In the modern world, we tend to assume that brutal caste divides and literal slavery were left behind for good in the pages of old history textbooks. But this country has proven to the entire planet with unbelievable cynicism that absolute, classic feudalism can easily be recreated in the 21st century. All you need to do is build a very high concrete wall and post armed guards at the entrance. The sprawling landscapes of Pakistani megacities have been violently sliced into two completely incompatible universes that never cross paths in real life, as if hacked apart by a blunt butcher's knife. On one side, you have endless gray slums where people choke on toxic smog every single day, where tens of millions of destitute citizens sleep on filthy dirt floors and fight to the death for a piece of stale bread. But right across the street, sitting behind barbed wire and heavy iron gates, are the so-called defense housing authorities and elite gated communities. These are genuine oases of insane luxury, owned by omnipotent army generals, heavyweight politicians, and shadow billionaires. Inside, you'll find perfectly paved, multi-lane highways, high-end international boutiques, and sprawling mansions drowning in lush tropical greenery. The most repulsive, surreal detail of this whole picture is the gigantic emerald green golf courses. While entire provinces are dying from catastrophic droughts, and while poor people just 500 yards away are drinking murky sludge swarming with deadly infections from puddles, massive industrial pumps extract millions of gallons of pristine artesian water every single day. They waste this water for the sole purpose of letting the wealthy elite comfortably hit a little white ball with a club on perfectly manicured fresh grass. This isn't just economic inequality. This is legalized social apartheid, elevated to the status of a state religion. Every morning, crowds of exhausted, starving men and women from the slums submissively trudge toward the security checkpoints of these elite enclaves. Guards armed with assault rifles roughly frisk them like potential terrorists, meticulously checking their electronic passes before finally letting them inside. These people work for absolute pennies as gardeners, cooks, nannies, and drivers. They scrub the dirt in colossal marble palaces and wash the expensive designer clothes of their masters, only to be unceremoniously thrown back into the dark, foul-smelling labyrinths of the ghetto by nightfall, because destitute servants are strictly forbidden from staying overnight in the billionaire's paradise. The new nobility genuinely, with all their cold hearts, despises their own people. They fly to Dubai and London for shopping sprees. They get their medical treatments in Europe's best clinics, and their kids study at the most prestigious British universities. They have created a completely artificial, absolutely sterile world for themselves, inside a dead country, cowardly barricading themselves away from the monstrous poverty behind the tinted windows of their heavy armored SUVs. They have zero desire to change anything. They have absolutely no need to improve public schools or build accessible hospitals for ordinary citizens, because they themselves will never, ever use those pathetic facilities. Power and wealth in this rotten system are passed down exclusively by inheritance, circulating within a tight circle of chosen families who have latched onto the sick body of the state like fat, blood-sucking ticks. For years, these families have been siphoning off the last remaining resources, ruthlessly converting the sweat of millions of poor people into their new offshore accounts and elite sports cars. Local laws are written exclusively for the poor. If a rich heir runs over a commoner at an intersection in his expensive vehicle, his father simply pays a minor settlement to the victim's family, and the police instantly close the case. This is the classic, naked rule of the strong, where money dictates absolutely everything, and a human life is worth precisely nothing. And these modern feudal lords naively believe that thick brick walls, electrified barbed wire, and private security contractors can forever protect them from the ocean of total starvation, violently crashing right against their doorstep. But history always brutally punishes such blind arrogance. When the starving mob finally breaks down those beautiful gates, no amount of security will save this artificial plastic paradise from the righteous, blind, and unbelievably bloody wrath of the people. The most terrifying, deepest wound on the body of any nation isn't shattered old factories or a hollowed-out state treasury. It is the quiet, almost invisible, yet 100% fatal hemorrhage of human intellect. When a country loses its money, it can always quickly borrow more from international lenders, or simply fire up the printing presses and send inflation to the moon. But when a nation irrevocably loses its best and brightest minds, no presidential decree on earth can reverse the damage. Right now, Pakistan is in the grip of exactly this kind of invisible, silent, yet historically colossal national catastrophe. Fleeing in sheer animal terror from this scorched, thoroughly corrupt land torn apart by religious zealots are the very people who were supposed to be building modern healthcare, coding complex computing systems, and designing new, safe cities. In 2023 alone, if dry official reports are to be believed, roughly 1 million highly qualified professionals left this country for good. Just let that monstrous, paralyzing number sink in. An entire million experienced doctors, talented engineers, school teachers, and skilled financiers who, in a single moment, packed their bags, bought one-way tickets, and permanently crossed their homeland out of their lives. They fly off to work in the sweltering Gulf states, or flee en masse to prosperous Europe, North America, and distant Australia, because they crystal clearly understand one very brutal, cold truth. In this broken, rotting system, a smart, highly educated person is not a valuable state asset. They are just a superfluous, highly suspicious, and absolutely useless cog in the machine. How can you force a brilliant surgeon to stay at a major public hospital when the power suddenly cuts out right in the middle of a complex operation, and his meager monthly salary barely covers the rent for a cramped, filthy apartment? How do you keep a young, promising software developer when the government can shut down mobile internet across the entire country at the snap of a general's fingers, just because of another political rally in the town square? These young men and women poured massive amounts of money and decades of hard work into their specialized education. Their aging parents sold off their last piece of fertile land to pay for university tuition. But at the end of the line, all they get is a blank concrete wall, rampant nepotism, and total injustice. In Pakistan, a successful career is built not on actual knowledge or innate talent, but entirely on whether you come from a powerful family, which well-connected people you drink tea with, and which military officer you handed a fat envelope of cash at the right time. The social elevator in this society is permanently stuck between floors, and its steel cables were ruthlessly slashed a long time ago. And the people who clearly realize that breaking through this concrete ceiling with honest, hard work is physically impossible simply choose voluntary exile. Meanwhile, the state doesn't even try to stop or retain them. On the contrary, fat cat bureaucrats in their corner offices cynically celebrate this mass exodus. For the thoroughly corrupt ruling elite, smart citizens capable of critical thinking pose a direct and very serious threat to their comfortable lifestyles. A smart person will inevitably start asking highly inconvenient questions about stolen taxes, massive corruption on construction projects, and why army generals own half the national economy. It's infinitely easier and safer for these rulers to govern an ignorant, beaten-down, uneducated mass that is incredibly easy to manipulate through cheap TV propaganda and pathetic handouts of free flour just before the next election. Plus, those same professionals who moved abroad will reliably send billions of dollars in remittances back home to their aging relatives every month, and this massive influx of cash goes right back into circulation, securely fueling this exact same rotten system and buying the elites fresh luxury cars. But these blind leaders don't understand, or simply refuse to accept, One simple fact. Right now, they are committing a slow, agonizing national suicide. Without good doctors, this multi-million-strong nation will start dying en masse from the simplest, long-forgotten infections. Without competent engineers, aging iron bridges and massive concrete dams will completely collapse under the pressure of the water during the next heavy downpour. Without honest teachers, the next generations of children will devolve into a blind, vicious, and aggressive herd that knows how to do nothing but smash store windows. Pakistan is performing a surgical lobotomy on itself, completely voluntarily, with a satisfied grin on its face. It is carving out the healthiest, most valuable, and most intellectually capable part of its own body and simply tossing it into the global dumpster. And when this monstrous process reaches its critical point of no return, this giant, overpopulated nuclear power will be left with only two categories of people. On one side, fabulously wealthy, heavily armed feudal lords hiding in their lush, gated communities. On the other, an endless, raging ocean of destitute, sick, and entirely uneducated zealots ready to kill a bystander for a stale piece of flatbread or for a sentence they simply misunderstood. In such a broken country, there will never again be any room for technological progress, modern science, or free art. It will be one giant, dark, boiling cauldron of primal ignorance that, in the very end, will inevitably explode and swallow its own greedy creators without a trace. Because a state that harbors such intense hatred and contempt for its own intellect is doomed to the most agonizing, filthy, and absolutely inescapable death in the cold dark. Right before its final collapse, any complex state system goes through the exact same stage of absolute blind denial of reality. The elites lock themselves tightly inside their lavish palaces, sipping expensive tea from porcelain cups, enthusiastically telling each other fairy tales about how the situation is still completely under control. But the clockwork is already ticking, and the cold metallic thud of the countdown echoes through the filthy streets of Islamabad, Karachi, and Lahore. Pakistan isn't just another poor developing nation that will quietly sink to the bottom and vanish off the global radar. It is a massive pressure cooker loaded to the brim with weaponized uranium. They have dozens, maybe even hundreds, of nuclear warheads stashed deep inside mountain bunkers. And that is the most terrifying, unpredictable combination in all of modern human history. A state physically incapable of providing its own hospitals with a stable power supply. A state where a mob of fanatics can burn down an entire city block with absolute impunity is sitting on doomsday weapons. We've all been deeply conditioned to believe that the nuclear button is always kept in the safe, sober hands of pragmatic generals who are just playing a game of geopolitical chess. But those generals lost their monopoly on power a long time ago. Radical factions aren't hiding in dark caves along the Afghan border anymore. They boldly march down wide capital avenues, dictating harsh terms to a government completely paralyzed by fear. And when the economy finally craters, when empty ATMs stop spitting out cash and gas stations run out of their very last drop of fuel, military discipline will instantly crumble to dust. A starving soldier with an assault rifle, who hasn't been paid for months, is not going to take orders from a well-fed general lounging in a gated community. He is going to follow the man who promises him a meal and points out a simple, clear enemy. And at that exact moment, the nuclear arsenal becomes easy, completely unguarded prey. The country will simply fracture into dozens of hostile feudal fiefdoms, where local warlords and spiritual clerics will carve up the scraps of its former glory. Just try to comprehend the scale of this geopolitical catastrophe. 240 million people trapped in a burning, arid wasteland, without laws and without a shred of hope. Tens of millions will flood across every available border, trampling any barricades in their path. They will march on foot into neighboring Iran. They will try to punch through into India, inevitably triggering the largest, bloodiest war the continent has ever seen. Global capitals will panic and slam their doors shut, but it will be way too late. You cannot isolate a supernova explosion when you are floating in the exact same tiny solar system. India, their eternal blood enemy, will be forced to put its own missiles on high alert, because nobody in their right mind is going to wait around for some fanatic who just hijacked a military base in Punjab to push the red button for his insane ideology. And what will happen to the very politicians and military brass who spent decades looting this country and driving it to clinical death? They will simply board their private jets, grab their families, and fly off to London, Dubai, or New York. They've had their backup passports ready for years, and their bank accounts are bursting with dollars embezzled straight from the national budget. They'll sit in expensive European restaurants, putting on sad faces to give interviews to international journalists about how hard they tried to save their homeland. But cruel fate and a foolish populace ruined everything. They will leave behind nothing but cracked, scorched earth, mountains of garbage, and millions of people they deceived and cynically abandoned. People who will have to pay for that monstrous greed with their own lives. This system is absolutely beyond repair. It cannot be salvaged with yet another tranche from the International Monetary Fund, because that cash will just burn up in the furnace of total corruption within a couple of weeks. The metastasis has infected absolutely every internal organ of this state body. Pakistan is a living, breathing testament to how blind hatred for your neighbors, the pathological greed of the elites, and flirting with medieval Dark Age fanaticism are guaranteed to kill any nation. And when the fuse on this gargantuan powder keg finally burns out, the world will shudder from a blast that will permanently alter the course of human history as we know it. The illusion of stability will evaporate into the thick air, leaving us face to face with a harsh, cold, and incredibly brutal reality where every single historical mistake is always paid for in human blood.